issues. I don't know which of you would like to go first, Professor Corbett?
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Kane, Vice Chairman Hamilton, and members of the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks. Thank you for inviting me to speak on a very important issue of standards for disaster, emergency management, and business continuity. I'd like to begin my testimony today with a brief overview of our national building codes and related emergency preparedness standards. Codes and standards establish the minimum level of acceptable performance. They also can be used as a ruler to see how specific facilities and emergency procedures measure up. Generally, codes deal with the built environment, the design of the buildings themselves. Standards typically establish procedural protocols such as how and when to evacuate a building. While this description generally holds true, emergency procedures have in fact found their way into codes, however. The design of buildings and the emergency procedures used within them are critically linked. For example, the ability to quickly and safely evacuate a building is based upon the relationship between the structure's design and its adopted evacuation procedures. Effectiveness and success are dependent upon the articulation between these two areas that are covered by the codes and standards. Despite the importance of life safety in buildings, we have no single code or standard to follow. Instead, we have a myriad of organizations preparing these documents, some of which are in the public sector, while others are in the private sector. Some are guidelines without the force of law, while others are statutes that must be followed. Several codes and standards overlap, while some are completely duplicative. Unbelievably, when it comes to terrorism-resistant building designs, we have no comprehensive national code for building designers to follow. Despite the fact that a certain number of many buildings within our country are potential terrorist targets, we have yet to develop a single set of comprehensive and detailed terrorism-resistant building regulations that provide a nationally accepted baseline. Generally speaking, building codes are enacted at the state and local levels of government. Cities and states typically adopt a model building and fire code, a set of nationally developed regulations, which can then be amended to meet local needs. There isn't any federal regulation that requires the adoption of a building or fire code at the state or local level. Some jurisdictions have not adopted any construction or safety codes at all. States and cities can choose from two sets of model building and fire codes, one prepared by the NFPA that was mentioned earlier, the other by the International Code Council, also mentioned. While these two sets of codes broadly cover the same topics, they are different in format and their specific requirements do vary. States and cities adopt one of these two sets of model codes and typically add their local amendments, making building safety uniformity difficult to achieve across the United States. Neither of these two sets of model codes addresses the issue of terrorism-resistant building design. If a building designer or building owner wishes to have their building made terrorism-resistant, they cannot simply look to their locally adopted model building and fire codes for guidance. They are forced to wade through a variety of narrowly focused terrorism guidelines that address specific issues such as glazing or air handling system design. Often the building designer owner is forced to retain the services of a consultant who conducts a risk assessment and to advise them as to how to deal with the problem without the benefit, again, of a single comprehensive and detailed national code to measure themselves against. The strength or weakness of the consultant's assessment and his recommendations is solely based upon the consultant's expertise, not the baseline of a national code. Obviously, most buildings do not need to be rendered terrorism resistant. However, many communities have potential targets within their boundaries. Building designers, owners, and community leaders should have the ability to assess a particular structure's vulnerability to a terrorist attack. It appears that the Department of Defense has made the only attempt at a broad set of terrorism-resistant design guidelines in their minimum anti-terrorism standards for buildings, UFC 4-010-01. It's very broad in nature, but it's primarily explosion-driven and lacks any real detail for either biological or chemical attacks. When it comes to national emergency preparedness protocols for evacuations and the like, the situation is a bit brighter. There are a variety of emergency planning tools, both standalone documents or as text embedded within larger safety-related documents. For example, OSHA requires that entities under their jurisdiction comply with specific emergency action plans, specifically fires and what they term other emergencies. They don't specifically address terrorism specifically, and the regulations themselves are very, very light in detail. Getting back to the NFPA and the ICC, they've recently upgraded both of their fire codes to include more extensive emergency planning requirements. These codes, however, again, must be adopted and enacted for them to have the force of law within a jurisdiction. For example, the state of New Jersey is in the process of adopting a new fire code, which will likely be the 2003 edition of the International Fire Code. Until that time of adoption, however, the requirements contained within these regulations cannot be enforced by the state. New York City has taken a different route. As a result of the attacks on the World Trade Center, they established a World Trade Center Building Code Task Force within the city's Department of Buildings to review the need for updating the city's building regulations. The task force issued a report including 21 recommendations, which included recommending full building evacuation plans to be developed for non-fire events in high-rise structures, and also another one that deals specifically with biological and chemical attacks by requiring heating, ventilation, air systems, fresh air intakes to be at least 20 feet above grade and away from any loading docks or loading bays. New York City Mayor Bloomberg subsequently reviewed these 21 recommendations and is now in the process of moving forward immediately with 13 of them, including those 2 I just mentioned. As mentioned earlier about full building evacuation, they're of great concern nationally to life safety specialists. Our model building codes do not anticipate full high-rise building evacuations. Stairwells are designed to handle the evacuation of only a few floors, leaving most occupants in the building to stay where they are located. The experiences of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing and the events of 9/11 certainly contradict this what we call defend-in-place strategy. That is common to nearly all high-rise buildings across the country. I'll mention briefly, there is an NFPA document, NFPA 1600, which the next panel will discuss in detail. I won't take up time talking about it, but it is an important document for emergency planning procedures. In light of what I've talked about, basically, there is a lot of work to be done. And obviously, this whole code situation is very complex and confusing. And you can imagine what it's like for the private sector to attempt to deal with these kind of issues. The private sector's entities must first establish what local laws apply to them, if any, and determine whether or not these codes or standards include provisions for emergency planning. If they're constructing a new building and desire that it be terrorism resistant, they will need to retain that consultant, as I mentioned earlier. A related issue that I just would like to briefly mention is the role of local and state government in approval of specific buildings and emergency procedures within them as it relates to terrorism preparedness. While emergency procedures used within a given building will typically fall within the jurisdiction of the local fire code enforcement official, the building design features are a different story. Should local governments dictate which buildings are terrorist targets and require specific anti-terrorism building features, or should the building owners make that decision themselves? I would suggest that the answer lies somewhere in between to that particular question. State and local governments must take an active role in conducting terrorism risk assessments within their communities and identifying their vulnerabilities. Building owners whose facilities are identified within that assessment should be encouraged to expand their emergency preparedness plans to include issues specifically of terrorism, if they do not already, and develop a list of terrorism-resistant building design upgrades to address the threat. A useful model to follow that would help move this forward quickly would be one that's used currently within the public sector called the Emergency Management Accreditation Program, or EMAPS, developed by several entities including FEMA, the International Association of Emergency Managers, and the National Emergency Management Association. This program accredits individual communities for their disaster mitigation, preparedness, and response and recovery programs. So here's something that is out there in the public sector right now that accredits specific communities across the United States that perhaps could be redefined and remolded for specific buildings within a community. In light of the situation, I've got some recommendations for the Commission to consider. The first one is that the Department of Homeland Security should take a very proactive role in beginning initiation of development of a code for terrorism-resistant building designs. The code should provide detailed and specific requirements that establish a minimum level of acceptable protection against terrorist attacks. Next recommendation would be that an accreditation program for private sector facilities that evaluate their emergency preparedness, both the physical plan and the emergency planning aspect, should be established. Such an accreditation program would not only be useful for building owners, but for local governments as well, because if you have an accreditation program like that, local communities can then make decisions on response plans of their own, determining how many people they're going to send to a particular facility and what they should expect to find there if there's a terrorist attack. The model code groups that I mentioned earlier, the NFPA and the ICC, should be encouraged to coordinate their emergency planning criteria. This will make it easier for multi-site private sector businesses with operations in many states to have a better chance of achieving uniformity. The fact that we have two model code groups, both competing for cities and states to adopt them, is a major issue I think that you probably should be looking into. And finally, the defend-in-place strategy that I mentioned earlier and the issue of full building evacuation needs to be thoroughly studied and assessed. Today's reality is that building occupants do not follow orders to remain in place during an emergency. it's very possible they will self-evacuate into stairwells that are not designed to handle the crush of people. We've ever seen that time and time again, especially we saw what happened in the Chicago high-rise fire about a month and a half ago, which I was disappointed to learn NIST, in fact, is not going to be investigating that because I thought that was such a landmark fire with this specific issue of concern. On that note, I'd like to thank you again for inviting me to speak and be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Corbett. Mr. Yim?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Vice Chairman Hamilton, distinguished Commission members, September 11th family members, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Comptroller General of the United States, David Walker, thank you all for your very important and dedicated efforts to improve Homeland Security for our nation and its people. We at GAO hope that our efforts have been of assistance to you, and we pledge our continued support. What I'd like to do is to highlight and illustrate some of the key points of my written testimony, and then be so presumptuous as to suggest some additional actions that could be taken along the lines of setting standards, national standards to improve Homeland Security. Are we better prepared to counter the threats of terrorism since September 11th and as a result of the startup of the Department of Homeland Security? The answer is certainly yes. Unfortunately, many believe that this is an inadequate standard by which to judge our success to date. Judging our success will depend to a large extent upon what we identify and set as our Homeland Security goals. As a nation, we are unlikely to definitively, quote, win the war against terrorism, since terrorist threats are subject to constant change, resources are finite, and it is simply impossible to be 100% secure in such an environment. Nor could our nation definitively say that we are doing enough for Homeland Security, since although much progress has been made, much more needs to be done. And like many of our complex issues facing our nation, always more could be done. Success for Homeland Security may be better measured in terms of continued progress toward becoming better prepared. And since Homeland Security relies upon the coordinated actions of federal, state, local governments, and the private sector, and in many cases upon layers of defenses, progress has to be measured across numerous dimensions. Standards, particularly system standards, management standards, hold great potentials to both improve coordination across such dimensions and enhance measurement of continued preparedness. Such standards addressing performance and design and what an organization does to manage its processes and related activities could help identify interdependencies, define roles and responsibilities, assign those responsibilities, and link federal, state, local governments, not-for-profits, and the private sector in a measurable, dependable, and reliable manner. We're not just talking about connecting the dots, we're talking about connecting players and connecting their capabilities to make our nations safer. The private sector already sets standards within various business chains, such as in the design, raw materials, supply, manufacture, sales, delivery, and customer support chains. Should we consider Homeland Security really as this type of business chain, where standards would be essential to measure and assure the stability and reliability of all links in this interdependent chain? And let me make clear, Dr. Corbett talks, and previous witnesses have talked about the importance of building standards, product standards, et cetera. There's another family of standards, system standards, a system engineering type approach that is equally important to talk about. So not only must we increase, for example, the bandwidth of our radios so that our first responders can talk to each other, we must have some sort of system standards that when they are able to communicate, they are acting in a coordinated, effective, efficient manner that does not put them at risk and enhances their effectiveness. I think we have much to learn, members of the Commission, from how we've approached other crises in the past and some disturbing ways in which we've approached crisis mode management. I'll take you back to the late 1970s when we first began to experience exploding automobiles, if I could use an example. You all recall the exploding Pintos when people would have automobile accidents. And what was the government response, industry response? Initially, it was to bolt on big bumpers to our automobile. If you recall, we all own these tremendously ugly cars. But the theory was that if I bolt on this big bumper, and of course, if I only got hit in the rear, in a vertical type of collision, that I would survive that crash. And over time, people began to realize that was probably not the most efficient way to handle it. We should have perhaps been designing automobiles to avoid accidents, to talk about more rigid body structures, better tires, better instrument panels that would not only fundamentally make the car safer, but also more efficient at the same time. To a large extent, we are at a big bumper stage in Homeland Security. How can we incorporate standards, Homeland Security principles to make not only the country safer, but the agency missions and the important business processes that we wish to make more secure, fundamentally more efficient also? One of the greatest concerns at the GAO is for Homeland Security, how will we address sustainability of the efforts, integration of the efforts so that we can incorporate Homeland Security principles into these agency missions and business processes without destroying the viability of those business processes themselves? How can we strike the proper balances between security and add the word security to economic security, financial market security, healthcare system security, environmental security, many other important priorities that this government must fulfill? And how do we hold people accountable, not only for the significant amount of funds that are being reprioritized for Homeland Security, but if we begin to assign responsibilities in some sort of systems approach, how can we hold these sectors accountable that if a crisis occurs, they will have the ability, they are sufficiently prepared to fulfill their assigned responsibilities? Moving away from this big bumper type approach allows us to systematically address the core issues necessary to become better prepared, to help us set priorities, to be able to continue to measure progress toward improving Homeland Security, to be able to address a key problem identified by our Comptroller General, who notes, at the quote, "At the present time, the federal government is flying either blind or with inadequate instruments in many areas. We need a government-wide strategic plan and annual performance and accountability plans that are linked in some way to key national indicators and integrated into agency individual plans." Where do we start? There are so many things that can be done, and it is unlikely, given the fiscal position of our government, that we can do them all. And certainly no one entity, federal, state, local, not-for-profit, private sector, can do everything. Instead, it is increasingly apparent that Homeland Security will require strategic and shared capabilities and investments among these federal, state, local governments and the not-for-profit and private sectors. These investments should emphasize the development, augmentation, maintenance, and linkage of capacity to respond to the three central missions of Homeland Security: prevent terrorism, reduce vulnerability, and respond and recover quickly in the event of an attack. The development of this type of capacity to counter a broad range of potential threats, an all-hazards approach, if you will, is critical due to the uncertainty as to the nature of the specific terrorist tactics to be employed and questions about sustainability of any other approach. It also will allow us to address the central core questions of what are these likely threat scenarios that we must address? Who is in charge and who should be in charge under these various scenarios? What should be done and what sector is in the best position to do that? Who pays for it? And how are we going to pay for it? How much is it going to cost? And again, how do we assure accountability? Again, both for the use of the funds as well as fulfilling the assigned responsibilities. We believe that one promising methodology is the adoption of national standards, both product and individual service standards, as Dr. Corbett mentioned, but also systems integration type standards. We've heard testimony today about various methods in which we could go about adopting some of the standards. The national strategies set some goals and milestones, but GAO has been critical of the ability of those national strategies to both horizontally and vertically integrate. Horizontal in the sense of coordinating the activities across the diverse federal agencies, and most importantly, vertical integration between the federal government, state and local, private sector, not-for-profit. We've heard some testimony about ISACs, these information sharing and analysis centers. GAO past work has found that there are currently 16 ISACs, and that although DHS has formal agreements with most of them, additional efforts are needed. Not all sectors have fully established ISACs, and even for those sectors that do, our recent work has showed that participation is mixed and the amount of information being shared between the federal government and private sector organizations vary. For example, efforts were still in progress to establish baseline statistics, and sectors do not or always coordinate among other sectors. It is absolutely crucial that if we're going to have a shared investment, shared responsibility strategy, that we have shared input into what that strategy should be. And if we are going to, as Chairman Kane indicated, involve the private sector in the protection of the 85% of the critical infrastructure that is owned by them, it is absolutely important that they have an input into the development of types of standards that the federal government and state and locals will employ. Certainly, it also will have an impact on the type of federal stimulus programs that need to be designed. We're not just talking about grant programs to state and local. Focusing today on the private sector, there are many ways, going to Commissioner Gorlick's question, how do we incent the private sector? We had testimony from insurance industry representatives. It's very interesting to look at some of the standards for environmental management that were adopted, the ISO 14000 series for environmental management, that set protocols for the handling of potentially toxic materials.